Welcome to Focus on the Falls. I'm John Mercure, talking about a very important topic today, something that's kind of hard to understand, but important that you understand. I'm looking forward to getting educated a little bit here. We're talking about finance in the district, how your tax dollars go to work, how the budget is set up in the district, and what that means to those of us that live in the community here. A couple of guests are going to help us sort this out. Keith Brightman is the Director of Finance and Operations in the district. Keith, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And Cathy Olig is the Board Treasurer and Finance Committee Chair for the school board. Cathy, good to see you.
Nice to see you too, John.
All right, so let's get into this. I've been really wanting to have this discussion because it's important that we all kind of understand this a little bit. Keith, maybe we start with an overview of the budgeting process in the Falls, maybe the philosophy. What goes into the thought process when we think about the district budget?
Sounds good. Yeah, I've been in school finance for 20 years now, and so essentially my entire career with an accounting degree and then a master's degree in school finance. And so I've lived with revenue limits and the current state aid formulas throughout my entire career. I worked for small rural districts and Elmbrook schools next door here and now Menomonee Falls. And so I've seen a pretty good demographic spread of different districts and how it impacts different districts in different ways. I think one thing we do really well here is we think long term. We don't make knee-jerk reactions to things. We plan strategically. We're very heavy into continuous improvement. We apply that to our budget process also. So we're looking to, again, invest long-term in things that make sense to improve the entire district. And so I guess that's the key thing that we look for with our process.
Before we get to Cathy here, give me a couple of the logistic items. What is the timing of the budget? When does it run? When does planning begin? How does all that part play out?
Yeah, to help communicate that out to our board and the public, we have a pretty detailed budget calendar that's publicly available at all of our meetings starting in late January all the way through October when the final budget's adopted and the tax levy is certified, and you can see next steps coming up. It's an 18-month process between the upfront planning, understanding the state aid and the state budget impacts on the budget process, and so it's very detailed. We don't get as much public participation as we'd like to see, and so we're always looking for feedback and at least discussion with the public on what the budget process looks like.
All right, we're going to talk about the revenue limits, state aid, all that stuff. But Cathy, take us inside the role of the board working hand in hand with the district, because you're the elected representatives. The people in this community count on you to help make these decisions. But there are professionals like Keith that do this for a living. Talk about the relationship as the finance committee chair and how that all plays out.
Yeah, I work closely with Mr. Brightman, and we plan our monthly finance committee meetings. We have a committee accountability calendar that maps out all of the topics that we're reviewing each month, and then also the topics that Mr. Brightman's department is working on each month. So it's very organized, and as Keith had said, we do look for public input on the budget. As the treasurer, I give the annual report at the annual meeting in September, and then also the Finance Committee reviews the vouchers reports on a monthly basis, and we approve those at each and every board meeting.
So Cathy, you hear from members in the community as an elected representative of the community, and most of us and most of you that thank you for serving, that serve on the board, don't have the background, the detailed background that people like Keith have. How do you balance you getting up to speed and making sure that you have everything you need to have those conversations with people in the community?
Sure. Well, I've been on the Finance Committee for 3 years. It's my second year as chair and treasurer. And I think you just learn a lot by being on the committee, by having seen different topics. And in those meetings, we just ask a lot of questions. So, certainly that's helped me answer questions from community members. But then, when there's something that's a little more complex, then I defer to Mr. Brightman, and he does a great job just keeping it easier to understand, although he does have very detailed spreadsheets on the revenue limit if you really want to dive in and get into details.
Yeah, I heard those might be available if we behave ourselves, right?
And I forced the committee to look at that at least annually, so yes.
All right, let's get into some of this a little bit because it's really important that we understand it. We've talked about a couple of terms already, Keith. Revenue limits and state aid. I want you to explain both of those and how they play out in our district. Maybe let's start with the revenue limit, when it was enacted, how it works. Take us inside that.
Yep, so what I tell the committee and others when I first start to talk school finance is be okay with things being a little counterintuitive. Things don't always make sense on the front end, but they do make sense when you start to put all the puzzle pieces together. So yeah, revenue limits came into place back in 1993. So again, I've been working with that throughout my entire career. And it was put into place to help control increases to local tax levies. Because prior to that, there was a problem where tax levies were going up 8%, double digits, and that's not sustainable. So they were put into place to help provide a more sustainable funding model for schools. And that's exactly what they did and do when they're kind of used properly.
So tell us about state aid. How does state aid play into that? Is there a formula? How does that work in our state?
Yeah, so there are two key formulas. The first one is that revenue limit formula. The second one is state aid. And that really distributes state support for schools more equitably across the state based on property wealth per student. And so when you look at statewide numbers of tax rates, it does a pretty good job of equalizing those things out and giving kind of a fairer playing field to districts that have lower property values per student.
It's not perfect, though. What are the pain points for a district like Menomonee Falls with these two formulas?
Yeah, it's not perfect. So wherever you were in 1993, that's where you entered the formulas, and that was your baseline. So districts that were higher spending at that point were locked in there. Districts that were very low spending were locked in there. So we were kind of in the middle of those two. And so, on average, we're at a decent place. Where we run into problems, and every district does, is when they don't put any new dollars onto the revenue limit formula. That provides no inflationary increase to us to cover salary and benefit cost increases and things like that. What we ask for is pretty nominal, a 1.75 to 2% increase year over year on the revenue side. And some years we get close to that. Many years over the last several years we've come out at maybe $50 per student, which is well below 1%. And anytime you have cost increases at 2% and revenue below that, you're making some kind of adjustments there to make things work. And so that's been a year-over-year thing that we've worked with. We've used that to our advantage at times to help rethink how we do things and what we do and do things better. Act 10 obviously came into place, was a big change in the structure. Menomonee Falls, for example, has no collective bargaining groups in place following Act 10. And so that provides both some benefits to us financially, but also some difficulties. We have to be much more aware of the market as far as teacher compensation and what's happening in other areas and other districts because it impacts us directly. So the decisions we make with the board are directly now our responsibility versus a collectively bargained type of structure. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, Cathy, I wanted to ask you about that. So a district wants to remain competitive. We want to attract the best educators and support staff. We want to keep the best people in the district, but there are limits to what we can offer to pay. How does the board weigh doing what we want to do for our kids with what we're able to do based on what the state gives us? It's a balance, isn't it?
It is. Well, and I think that's why we spend so much time in the budgeting process. So we look at all the different assumptions going into a budget year. That's something that we're doing now for the next budget year. And I think it's just sort of a balancing act. And we certainly look at recommendations from staff. We get input from the personnel committee and the director of HR, who is underneath the finance and auxiliary services umbrella that Mr. Brightman leads. So you just try to weigh all the factors and try to prioritize what's most important.
I know you hear from a lot of people in the district about a lot of different things. Where is finance on the list of all the other things that you hear about? Where are our taxes and budgeting when you hear from people? Is that on the list?
Yeah, it's certainly on the list, and unfortunately we've had a lot of great news coming from finance. So yeah. We aren't getting a lot of questions per se, but I think that's why, and one of my goals is to just keep educating our taxpayers on what's happening in finance. And certainly everyone will see their tax bill and they're seeing a decrease, so they should be glad about that, but certainly there are some more long-term implications that we're looking at. So this may not be repeatable depending on what happens with future budget cycles.
So Keith, I get conflicted because I see my tax bill and I'm like, yes, a little more money in my pocket. Everybody likes their taxes to go down. But as somebody who lives in this district and loves this district and had my kids go through it, I'm conflicted because I want to look out 5 years, 10 years, 20 years and make sure that the district is healthy. And it's a real balancing act that you guys have to work through.
It is, and it's a balancing act at the state level too, and I get the struggles that they have at that level to do what they need to do to have a good state budget. This year, for example, at Menomonee Falls, our our state aid went up by $2.4 million. The direct impact of that is our levy went down by $2.4 million. So again, that's great. That translates to a reduced tax bill across the community. What the not so good part about that is it may not be sustainable. The reason that happened is because the legislature put all of the money into state aid, not into any more spendable revenue authority for us. So all it did was supplant local taxes for the state aid piece there. So the fear is that's not sustainable in future biennial budget cycles for the state. And to the extent that it is, they still need to provide those inflationary increases to offset our cost increases.
So massive federal COVID relief poured into every state in the nation, and a lot of that came into the state went towards education. The state budget included no revenue limit increases because of that aid in large part. Can you explain what that means and how that played out?
Yeah, so that's it's a big deal. So the federal government had 3 layers of COVID relief funding. The first one was pretty minor, happened back about a year and a half ago, or a year and a few months ago. The second one was much larger, happened in December, and that one was called CARES 2, and we, at that time, had a little bit of concern that that would disrupt the state budget process, seeing the magnitude of dollars coming into the state. For Menomonee Falls, we don't get a lot of that money from CARES 2. If you fit in well with the title funding formulas, so if you're the top 20 districts in the state size-wise and have higher poverty levels, you get a lot of funding from that. And then CARES 3 came into play, and that was in March of 21, and that one was by far the largest. And that has both a title portion and then a discretionary portion. So the Falls is going to get over the next 2 to 3 years about $4 billion of that federal funding. But over half of that is tied to a discretionary part of CARES 3, which right now has been kind of pushed back by the federal government, saying it wasn't done according to the way that they allow it to be done. So I know there's some more work to be done in Madison on that.
Another kind of confusing aspect of property tax levy calculations and the bills is the use of the different value calculations. The district's required to do certain things. What does that mean?
Yeah, that concern came up last year because we had a situation where our tax levy was up slightly. The way that we show it based on fair market values that we get from the Department of Revenue showed a tax increase of 0.5%, so very nominal in the scheme of things. But people were seeing about a 7%-ish increase on some property values or property tax bills. And so reconciling that is difficult. We're required by statute to approve our budget and display our tax rate by fair market value index. The village and all municipalities then take that and distribute taxes across assessed values. So you'll see both numbers on your tax bill. But to the extent that they don't line up, there's going to be a mismatch to what they show versus what we have to show. And so part of our discussions with legislators too is we'd like to see the same index. We'd like to see both use fair market values, and then you would see the same impact on your tax bill as we're talking about when we approve our budget.
Continuous improvement, Cathy. I know it's a core tenet of what happens in the district, and it's led to a lot of success in a lot of areas in this school district. How does continuous improvement play into your work as the finance chair and play into the financial work that happens in our district?
No, I think it's just part of making sure that we're operating well as a committee, making sure that we're planning meetings efficiently and that we're giving proper guidance. I look to get feedback from the committee members and certainly welcome feedback from the board members. And I know that then we talk to about the committee, the accountability calendar and where we might be able to move things around. And certainly Mr. Brightman informs the group of things that they're doing internally to make improvements.
Keith, is figuring out the finances for a district more or less complicated than it was 25 years ago?
I'd say it is more complicated. We're working with, again, just not, when revenue limits came into place, they had that CPI index to the revenue side. That's kind of gone away, and so that makes it much more difficult to balance out and sustain what you have. There's good aspects to that. You have to rethink what you're doing and apply our continuous improvement practices to that. But at some point, you reach the point where you need to just sustain what you have and build on what you have, and you can't do that under the current revenue limits with no new funding and uncertain next state budgets too. The concern is, there's billions of dollars coming again to those biggest 20 districts, and a lot of that money will probably be left on the table at some point, and that's going to look like statewide the money wasn't needed, where it's just not the case with 90% of the districts that are in the state. So it's a different conversation depending on the type of district you're talking about.
Obviously, you continue to do this because at some level you find it rewarding and it's very important work. Thank you for doing it. When you think about the financial calendar and dates and deadlines, what's your favorite time of the year as far as your job goes?
I like right now that we're doing projections for the next one. So it's a lot of playing in the sandbox with what ifs. We're talking now about, some of them are difficult to discuss, but it's kind of fun to think about. Wage pressure on wages is there. We know that throughout every sector in the economy right now. And so we need to work with that along with our other budget inputs and make everything fit and put together and provide a budget that the board can live with, the community can live with, and it provides, again, that improvement structure for our system.
Cathy, you do so much work away from the committee meetings and the big board meeting every month. I mean, time you could be with your family where you are working on this sort of stuff and getting a grasp on it and making sure that as the finance chair you know what's going on. How rewarding is it when it all comes together and you realize that, the district's able to thrive?
Yeah, it feels really good, and I see it firsthand with my kids and the excellent education they're getting, the amazing teachers they have, and just the high, extremely talented people we have staffing our buildings and our district office. So it is really wonderful. We do live in a great community, and I'm just so grateful that we have such amazing schools. So.
What did we miss, Keith? I want you to make sure that we get a better understanding. Is there anything we need to hit on when we talk about school finance?
I think it's again that community engagement. We just don't get it. And we do provide over 25 opportunities between finance, public open meetings, board meeting discussions. And so we do want the feedback, we do want the questions. And so feel free to reach out directly or via those formats to ask your questions and be engaged with our process.
So when you get this bill in the mail, and we all got ours not that long ago, realize all the work that goes into making these numbers work and the difference it makes for our children, the difference it makes for our community. Because even if you don't have kids that are in the district right now, it impacts your home value. It impacts the quality of life in the community we live in. Keith Brightman is the Director of Finance and Operations for the district, and Cathy Olig is the Board Treasurer and Finance Committee Chair. This has been so helpful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.